Oranges and Lemons was seen as the big investment following the success of Skylarking.
Yeah.
And so there, at this point, Tarquin Gotch was managing XTC, and we were all trying to work out ways that we could persuade Andy to get back on a stage.
Yeah.
And Andy wasn't having it. There was one point at which they tried the trick of saying that they'd got Thomas Dolby to stand in for him. And he said, "I'm not falling for that one." "No, you haven't." And he was right.
Do you actually know if they asked Dolby? I've heard stories that Thomas Dolby didn't know anything about this.
Dolby had some connections with them in the past.
Yeah. Well, Andy's performed on his records and produced early singles and stuff.
Yeah,
so.
but no, as far as I know, Thomas Dolby knew nothing about it. And it was exactly what Andy spotted. It was a scam. They did talk about doing a flatbed truck tour where they'd be playing on the back of a flatbed truck outside the record company's offices in various parts of the United States. And they were going to do the same in Japan, but Andy almost gave in and then backed off again. And so, although Mayor of Simpleton did well, I think, in America, and a couple of the others did quite well, it didn't have the level of success that...
Were you around at all for the radio tour?
Well, that followed on from it. That was their answer to not actually appearing in front of an audience, was to go and do that. So no, I wasn't. They did all that on their own. I'd gone home long since. I mean, I think it was a good idea because it was something Andy could handle. But the pressure of the earlier touring on all of them had been so huge. And in fact, later on, Andy started to think about playing live again, I believe. And Colin said, "No, I don't want to." So that was that. Yeah,
I mean, certainly my understanding is more recently it's Colin that's been very reticent. Although obviously he played with Terry a couple of years ago in Swindon, did a week's worth.
Yeah.
But since then he's kind of stepped back again.
Andy and I had been talking about producers. He phoned up and said, "What did I think of Gus Dudgeon?" And Gus was a friend of mine, and I loved Gus. Mm-hmm. And he was, as far as I was concerned, entirely the wrong person for the job.
Why do you say that?
Because Gus and Andy would not click in the right way.
Yeah.
Gus thought Andy was fantastic, absolutely fantastic, and there was much merriment. And I think that after Gus died, because he died in a car accident, his wife and he was killed, Chris Hook, who was his best mate, who'd been with him that night before he died, was given a load of Gus's stuff, and I think that includes at least one DAT tape that should outstrip the Trogs tapes by a mile, because he ran a DAT machine throughout the sessions, which were very long.
Yeah.
Just because there were mics scattered around the studio recording just onto that, just because Andy was so funny.
Yeah, I mean, some of that audio verity's come out, hasn't it? I mean, the that wave stuff and all those kind of things.
Yeah.
But there's more.
Andy produced the Lilac Time.
Yes.
And I went down for those sessions at Rockfield. Uh-huh. And I found a couple who played cello and viola who lived in Devon, not too far from Monmouth. Uh-huh. And so they drove up through the pouring rain in their Volkswagen Combi and arrived absolutely sodden at Rockfield Studios, which is, I think probably one of my favourite studios anywhere in the world. Just such a great place to work. And Andy, as a producer, is like he is on his own records. He's incredibly precise and detailed. He's a visionary, but also very difficult to move. And this couple came in their caggles dripping, and he wanted them to play a glissando from that was in harmony. I don't know, a fifth or a third or something like that apart. And stayed exactly a fifth or a third apart, for the full length of the glissando.
Okay.
So on a viola, that's a distance of about that much, and on a cello, that's a distance of about that much. And they had to stay completely in tune with each other for this movement. All of them have been asked at some point or another to play with extraordinary people.
Yes.
Andy's obviously, I was around when he was doing the Peter Blegvand stuff, the Naked Shakespeare, and Blegvand's, I think, is a genius, and the two of them together was quite something. And Harold Budd, all those other,
sadly passed away last year.
Yeah, all those other people that Andy worked with, some of whom, as a producer, it often didn't work out, but that's basically because he's so driven. He's so clear in what he wants to do. Andy and I spent hours sitting in his living room looking at old TV shows that he got on video.
Okay. Jerry Anderson stuff and things like this, or?
Yeah, things like, the early Jerry Anderson stuff.
Supercar and...
Yeah, quite.
Yes.
What other thing? I remember him building, when the shed was built, I've got a funny feeling the guy who built it was called Bond. And he was always making a joke about him being James Bond. But that may not be true. Could be a complete lie. If you do write a book in a modular way, it's you're an author. It's easier to do.
Yeah.
Because you can have little milestones along the way and feel you've actually achieved something.
Yeah.
And so I wrote the first chapter as a tryout for Andy, and he read it and he came out and went, "Whoa, Nev, it's all right, but it's missing a little something. It's a bit dead." I said, "Well, what do you suggest?" He said, "Well, you're not in it." And I said, "Well, I don't think I should be in it." He said, "But the bit you've written about is about you as well. You're in it. So make it feel more personal," which is what I did. And later on, he told me I shouldn't have done that. Such is life.
How were Colin and Dave about it? Did they go along with the idea? Did they very much, think this is the right way to go? Or?
Colin was up for it. Dave wasn't.
Yeah.
It was getting a bit hairy. They were in the recording phase on Apple Venus and was Star, but at the time it was still supposed to be one album, and it was going to come out in time for the book. And Dave was feeling a bit racked off with life in general and said, "I don't really want to be involved." So we found a way around that later. But for most of it, I would get on the train every week from London, go down to Swindon, sit in Andy's shed with Colin and Andy and run a tape machine, and we'd just go through it bit by bit by bit. And I've got those recordings somewhere, and they're hilarious.
Not bad.
Yeah, both from Andy's outpourings and their banter and Colin's flatulence, and which at one point you can hear us clearing the room. Because we used to have these, I don't know why, Andy always served up curry soup for...
He likes curry. He likes a curry, a co-op curry.
But it's like a tinned curry soup.
Yeah.
We had a lot of that. And then I started piecing the book together. And in the end, John Leckie lent me he'd gone away on some big project, and so he said, would I look after his house in West Wickham? And I finished off the book there. And we sent it to Hyperion, and they went, far too long.
Right.
So the original draft is 50% longer than the...
Okay.
And Andy was really upset about that.
Right.
Because he wanted all that detail in there. And some of the songs have quite short snippets written about them, and they originally might have had 2 or 3 paragraphs.
There's a particular song that comes to mind that has one line written about it, which I guess we still can't talk about, and that's I Bought Myself a Lyrebird. You say in the book, contractually obliged not to talk about this song. Yeah. I assume that's still the same?
Yeah.
Did you at any point consider, or had you hoped maybe to talk to Terry or Barry at all for that project?
Yeah, we contacted both of them, and at the time, neither of them wanted to.
Right.
And funnily enough, one night, years later, I was sitting on the top deck of a number 23 bus going around Paddington, and I looked at the guy sitting next to me and realised it was Barry. I said, "Hello, Barry," and he said, "Hello." And I said, "I'm Neville Farmer." He went, "Ah, yeah." He said, "Actually, the book was all right in the end." He said, "No, I quite enjoyed it. Well done." But you know, it also helped hone down the story in a way.
Yeah.
To have Colin and Andy bashing against each other, which is what they'd done so well in all that writing time. And then Dave afterwards, he and I sat down together for a couple of days and went through everything, and he added in what he wanted to say as appropriate.
It must have been quite a difficult time, because obviously, as we're talking about the Apple Venus sessions, Dave's dissatisfaction with how everything was going on, and as you just explained, his deciding to talk to you at a later date about those songs for the book. It must have been a very difficult time. I mean, very difficult to actually. That whole atmosphere must have been pretty tense.
Yeah, I guess it was. I mean, I seem to remember it was. I know. While they were working, they were just working, and that's fine. And when Dave's working, he's just so focused. There wasn't really a problem there, but there was definitely quite a bit of tension around. Haydn Bendall, who's producing, is such an easygoing man, and has a great way of bringing calm into a room. So that was fine. We also did some sessions. I think it was a session at Abbey Road with Mike Batt.
Yeah.
Which I was there for, and there were about 5 or 6 of us there as well. I think Peter Fitzpatrick was there, and maybe a couple of other people. But yeah, there was concern as well, because Andy wanted to do 2 albums worth of material, and I was buried in the book and trying to get that finished in time for a 1 album thing. And so, when the book eventually, I mean, I also supplied endless imagery for the book, which Andy gave me tons of, and quite a lot of that got rejected. A lot of it ended up printed very small. Andy and I were both unhappy about the paper they printed it on, because the photos don't come out well. And it was mainly because Hyperion were a bit miffed that their original plan had gone awry, because there was no album. And it was another year before there was an album.
Sure.
And suddenly there's Apple, Venus and Wasp Star. But by then, Hyperion had gone through their marketing cycle, and they'd flown the band out to Japan.
Yeah.
There's a Japanese version of it with my name spelt wrongly on it. And it's much better than the Hyperion one to look at. It's really quite...
That's much nicer, isn't it?
Beautiful. Yeah. And Andy said that he signed more books than he did albums while he was out there. But the book did well enough. It was #1 in the Q book charts, and was in the top 10 for 6 months, and Helter Skelter in Denmark Street with a sub-publishers, and they went into second print and everything. But we never saw a penny back from Hyperion, who said we haven't sold any, and which is kind of curious.
Yeah.
And so Andy, of course, once again got stung.
The photos, the images that are used in the book, how did the selection for those come about?
We had a huge library of material. I think the best stuff isn't the photos, it's Andy's drawings.
Sure.
Andy's illustrations are brilliant. Hyperion didn't want Andy's picture of Todd Rundgren as a cart horse.
I wonder why.
He thought he might take offence. I have spoken to Todd in the last couple of years about it, about the whole skylarking thing. And the thing that annoys him the most is Andy going on about how when they remastered to put Dear God onto the album, that whoever remastered it mastered it out of phase. And that's why, as far as Andy's concerned, that version sounds rubbish. Todd insists that isn't true, that there's nothing wrong with it from that perspective, but that something might have happened later in the pressing process. But he says certainly wasn't out of phase, and in fact the mastering engineer he used is, one of the best people in the world, and he's quite vocal about that. He's very loud, is Todd. He's very loud, but he's also got strong opinions. So I can imagine that he and Andy must have had a fairly up there in the hippie land of Woodstock, creating sparks.
I mean, it is one of those things. The story of Andy and Todd not getting on is now the stuff of legend. It's the stuff of XTC legend, and it's always going to be part of the story. But Andy's certainly mellowed a lot over the years towards that whole period of time, and his opinion of the album as it stands now is, Todd ended up producing a masterpiece.
Yeah, he did.
I don't think there's any, no matter what happened, the friction that was in the studio brought out one of the greatest albums of the 80s.
Dave Gregory is a really special person. He really is a special guy. I mean, and all the way through the book, Andy and Colin were admitting that they felt that they were musically his inferior. They'd known him as teenagers as being the star player in the area. And Dave has a very specific way of working that's completely different from Andy. Andy's much more improvisational when they're recording. Dave works out everything carefully and writes out the dots and then plays it. So he would quite often do arrangements, brass, strings, all sorts of things like that. But there was always this problem that he wasn't writing.
Yeah.
Wasn't considered a writer. Didn't like that. Wanted to be a fully fledged member of the gang.
Sure.
And so there was always a little bit of that. Andy is a control freak. He's one of the cleverest, funniest, most visionary, generous people I've ever known. But he can also be really stubborn. And Dave, with his own issues over health, plus the fact that he joined the band later. I think it. By the time they got down to Apple, Venus, and Wasp Star, he was starting to question his involvement with the band. I think it's fair to say he may disagree with me about that, and if that's the case, I'm sorry, Dave. But it certainly felt that way at the time, and that's why he didn't want to be involved with the book. He joined in reluctantly later on. His comments are much more pointed because there were fewer of them, and. But they were very useful because he could step back from the Colin Andy dynamic.
I think you need that balance. So you need. And sometimes you need a critical voice to come in and explain why maybe this doesn't work or why it didn't work for him at that time.
I know that during that time it was becoming very uncomfortable, the dynamic between them all, but. I don't think any one of them, either Colin or Andy, would in any way criticise Dave as a vital musical member of the band. I think he's just too good.
I mean, I've had many conversations with Andy over the years, and Dave's always been up there as far as it goes.
Yeah, and he's. I remember on Oranges and Lemons in particular, watching him working there and carefully working out some of the most complicated guitar and keyboard bits and pieces to play for that. And yeah, great guy as well. I phoned up Gregsy and I said, "Are you going to come down and see Denny Walley?" He adored his playing, and he went, "Oh, I don't know, Nev. I don't think I can do that." I said, "Well, I'll speak to him. I'll get you a ticket." "Oh no, I don't like going gigs for free. I'm a musician. It's not fair." So I went and spoke to Denny Walley and I said, "Do you like XTC?" He said, "I went to see them 2 or 3 times in California."
Yeah.
And I said, well, Dave Gregory says he'd love to see you play. Does he live near here? I said, yeah. He said, tell him his name's on the door. And I said, he says he doesn't want to pay. He said, well, I paid to see them. He doesn't have to pay to see me. And so Gregsy came down, and he was so like, oh my God, because Denny Walley, his hero, was all over him, saying, wow, it's so great to meet you.
He's a very humble man, Dave. He's a very humble man.
Very humble. Yeah. I think he totally underestimates how important he is musically.
I'd agree. I think he underestimates how revered he is by not just by the fan base, but by an awful lot of musicians.
Yeah. When
Colin was approached by Dave Gilmour to play for Pink Floyd.
That was before I met them.
Right.
Yes, I was a bit surprised. He said, why did you turn it down? He might have earned a living. But it's a bit like, was it his mother trying to get him to audition for the Harmonics in Swindon when he'd already got XTC? I think he just said, I don't want to be a gigging musician.
Yeah, I don't think he fancied a year away on tour. Or it would have been probably longer than a year, wouldn't it, with Floyd? It's a world tour.
Yeah, and maybe longer, but was it Guy Pratt got the job in the end and is still playing with Nick Mason's band now.
I remember Andy telling me that he thought Colin should have taken the job because it would have been a really good earner for him.
Yeah,
but
a friend of mine plays saxophone for Roger Waters.
Oh right,
and lives in a council house in Cricklewood, and gets picked up by a limousine and taken to the Jet. Yeah. XTC's progression, you can hear the changes in. Once Steve Lillywhite and Hugh Padgham were producing them, and they started using the townhouse and the stone room and that Phil Collins drum sound and all those sorts of things were all part of designing more and more elaborate studio buildings, floating rooms and extraordinary surfaces and moving bits and pieces to change the sound. And then someone invented 8-track digital. And people said, well, we can do most of this at home. And it'll cost £100 to do what we were paying £1,000 for. And the record companies loved that.
Sure.
Obviously. And so the budget started coming down and the studios started disappearing. I think what makes the albums particularly stand out from each other is the difference between the producer being an engineer and the producer being a musician.
Sure.
And the engineered albums have quite a different feel from bringing in Todd or Mummer. Everybody ignores Mummer, and I think
it's a fantastic record.
Steve's production on that is so musical, really musical. And although Oranges and Lemons is very much a poppy sort of record and very polished and slick and very much of its time, Paul Fox is a musician first and foremost. He's a jazz keyboard player.
Sure.
And so it feels like it. You can hear that difference. So when Steve Lillywhite and Hugh Padgham get hold of it, it has a different type of sense about it. The same, I guess, with Haydn and Gus. And then the difference between tracks that Mutt Lange produced compared to John Leckie and so on. And also I think it's interesting, you can hear the characters of the producers.
Very much so, yeah. Yeah, I think every producer has brought something different.
Leckie leaves space for everybody to do their thing. He doesn't over-embellish. So he's an engineer. Hugh Padgham's an engineer. But others are musicians, and that influences the nature of the XTC albums.
Definitely.
It's worth listening to for that. It's a fascinating thing, the way in which Andy, being so musically visionary, and other musicians jar or succeed. Leckie leaves space for everybody to do their thing. He doesn't over-embellish. And I love that about his work. He's a brilliant man. And we were talking recently about the possibility of doing a book together, because his whole history comes from being totally non-musical, he says. So there's absolutely no way he's a musician. He grew up in an environment where music wasn't there. And his whole thing was science fiction. And he was taken by some friends from school to the Radio Luxembourg studios in Regent Street, and saw the control room and thought, I want to work in a place like that. And he'd just done his school dissertation on something to do with creating an oscillator. And a job came up at Abbey Road for a tape op, for an apprentice.
Yeah.
And so he went along for this. He was 18, maybe.
He's very young, certainly, yeah.
And he was taken in as Ken Townsend, who was deputy lead head then, and I can't remember the guy who was running the place at the time, and they interviewed him, and they gave him the job there and then, and the boss said to Ken Townsend, well, take young John around to the studios and have a look around the studios. And the first studio you walk into, coming out of the offices at the top, is Studio 2. And he walks in, and there's George Martin, who goes, oh, hello, nice to meet you, and I think Jeff Emerick. And they look down into the studio, and there's the Beatles, and Yoko Ono lying in a bed.
Okay.
And Ringo's there doing this, dum, dum, diddly, 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 diddly. And he thought, that's weird, it sounds like it's African. So he went home and told all his mates that the Beatles were making an African record, which was Come Together. And that's the first time that John had ever been into a studio, was witnessing...
Isn't that amazing?
That going on.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And his whole background is like that. You know, he was tape up on Dark Side of the Moon, and got to his first. I think the first mix he ever did was a Syd Barrett track. I know which one it is, and it's gone out of my head. Plasticine Man. Anyway, his background is like that, and so he's part of that Abbey Road EMI training.